He walked into the wilderness, but he'll regret it. First came a single shoe left behind, then a forgotten backpack scattered on the forest floor. A cracked phone, a hidden journal page. Each clue raises more questions than answers. The police have uncovered several leads, but will they be enough to reveal the truth before it's too late? The Sierra Nevada mountains rose like solemn sentinels in the fading light, their jagged peaks washed in crimson as the sun dipped behind the horizon, shadows spilling long and cold into the valleys below, and the air carried the thin metallic bite of approaching nightfall. Wind whispered through the ponderosa pines with a mournful note, rattling branches and scattering brittle pine needles across the cracked asphalt of a mountain highway, where, just beyond a blind curve, the bus sat motionless. A hulking shape painted in muted colors now dulled by dust and weather, its once bright decals of tour company logos barely visible in the dying light, the headlights dark, the door hanging open as though frozen in mid-invitation, and within, the stillness was so complete that it seemed to hum with its own uncanny energy, a silence deeper than silence, thick enough to suffocate. Ranger Caleb Morgan, a man seasoned by years of patrolling these back roads, slowed his truck when he spotted the vehicle, instantly uneasy because buses were rare up here and rarer still abandoned on the shoulder. And as he stepped out, the chill mountain air hit him like a wall, his boots crunching gravel as he approached cautiously, hand instinctively brushing the radio clipped to his shoulder, eyes narrowed against the deepening dusk. He called out, "Hello? Anybody inside?" But his voice died against the trees, swallowed whole by the endless green silence. And when he climbed the steps into the bus, his flashlight beam swept over a tableau that rooted him in place. Every seat carried a story half-finished, sweaters draped over armrests, guidebooks open on laps that no longer had readers, a child's stuffed bear lying in the aisle with its button eye staring back, and overhead compartments bulging with untouched luggage, the faint smell of coffee lingering as though the passengers had only just left their seats, yet not a single soul was present, no movement, no voices, not even the echo of departure, as though dozens of people had simply dissolved into the air. The engine was cold to his touch, suggesting it had been parked for hours, but there were no skid marks on the road, no sign of distress, no shattered glass, no forced entry, nothing to indicate panic or violence. And yet the emptiness screamed louder than any crash or struggle could, because absence leaves its own scar. His chest tightened as he clicked the radio, his voice steady but taut. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Morgan. I got an abandoned tour bus up on Highway 108 near Granite Pass. Engine off, door open, no occupants in sight. Request immediate backup." And even as he spoke, his mind chased the questions clawing at him. Where had they gone? How had they gone? Why was there no trace? And why did it feel like the mountains themselves were holding back an answer? Minutes later, the local sheriff's SUV pulled up, headlights casting long beams through the trees. Sheriff Ellen Vargas stepping out, her lined face grim as she mounted the bus steps, her own sharp eyes scanning the same surreal scene. And when she descended, she shook her head slowly, whispering, "People don't just vanish like this," though the words lacked conviction, more like she was trying to convince herself. As the two stood in the crisp evening air, silence pressing down with suffocating weight, Morgan noticed something by the edge of the shoulder, just beyond the bus's open door, pressed into a patch of dirt at the border where asphalt met pine needles. A single shoe print, distinct, fresh, human, the impression of a hiking boot leading outward into the forest, and his pulse quickened as he crouched over it, because when he followed its faint trail with his beam, it led a mere 6 feet before it stopped dead. No drag, no continuation, just ended as if the walker had taken one last step and then ceased to exist. His breath fogged in the air, his throat dry as he muttered, almost to himself, "How do dozens of people leave behind everything and then simply stop?" And the unspoken terror hung heavy between him and Vargas. The question that would haunt them both long after the mountain night swallowed the scene whole. The morning after the discovery of the empty tour bus, the Sierra Nevada mountains awoke beneath a blanket of thin mist, and what had once seemed like just another rugged wilderness now pulsed with the urgency of a mystery too large to ignore, as within hours the scene swarmed with search crews, deputies, volunteer hikers, and emergency vehicles, their flashing lights casting fractured glows across the still, silent forest that had swallowed 32 souls without explanation. Helicopters thudded overhead, their rotors chopping the cold air as they swept over valleys and ridgelines, their searchlights piercing into canyons where pines grew so thick the sunlight itself rarely touched the earth. While on the ground, long chains of volunteers fanned through meadows and undergrowth, fluorescent jackets bobbing like fireflies as they combed the slopes, calling names into the emptiness, the sound bouncing back off granite walls with mocking hollowness. And beside them moved trained dogs, noses pressed to the ground, tails stiff with focus, handlers tugging leashes as they tried to catch even the faintest trace of human scent, but time and again the dogs faltered, circling, whining, confused, as though the trail began strong near the bus and then vanished into nothing, dissolving the way footprints had of the roadside. The landscape itself seemed to resist intrusion, steep ravines cutting the search parties into smaller groups, scree slopes shifting treacherously under. Boots, one false step sending stones tumbling hundreds of feet, snow still clinging to shadowed gullies even in late spring, and weather complicating every effort, with sudden squalls sweeping through the peaks, winds gusting so violently that the helicopter crews were forced to ground themselves for hours, while higher up avalanches rumbled like distant thunder, cascading walls of ice and rock that made entire sections of terrain impassable. Fear of predators added to the unease, with reports of mountain lion tracks near a tributary creek and fresh bear scat discovered not far from where one of the search grids had been marked. Yet even predators leave traces, and what unsettled the searchers most was the absolute lack of evidence. No torn clothing, no blood, no panicked footprints scattering into the woods. Nothing but absence, an absence that grew heavier with every fruitless hour. At the command post set up near Granite Pass, tension simmered between officials and family members, who had rushed up the mountain when news of the bus spread, their faces drawn with shock and disbelief, some clinging to the hope of a rescue, others already suspecting something far darker, and inside the heated tense Sheriff Vargas tried to keep control as state emergency managers leaned toward the natural disaster theory, speculating that a landslide or sudden storm had forced the tourists to flee the bus and scatter. But that did not explain the cold engine, the organized belongings, or the eerie silence, and one man in particular, a tall, gaunt figure with tired eyes named Daniel Rowe, brother of one of the missing passengers, stood and slammed his hand against the folding table, his voice raw with fury as he shouted, "You're wasting time pretending this was an accident. 32 people don't just walk away in the middle of nowhere and vanish. Not without someone making it happen." And though deputies tried to calm him, his words echoed what many feared to admit because the facts didn't align neatly with storms or slides. Meanwhile, Ranger Caleb Morgan, whose unease had only deepened overnight, wandered back through the bus again, flashlight lingering on every detail, trying to picture the last moments before it emptied. And as he crouched near his seat toward the back, he noticed something overlooked. A slim, black phone jammed between the cushions, its battery drained but otherwise intact. And when he carried it to the tech unit stationed at the command tent, they quickly connected it to a portable charger, the screen flickering to life to reveal a background photo of smiling faces, tourists clustered together against the backdrop of a towering cliff face. All joy and excitement on the first day of their trip, but the gallery held more, hundreds of pictures documenting hikes, roadside stops, selfies against waterfalls, and then, buried deep, the last recorded image, time-stamped 2 hours before the bus was discovered empty. And this one was different. It showed the shadowed edge of the forest, the frame shaky as though the photographer snapped it in haste, and though the image was grainy, there was something within it half concealed among the trees, a figure, tall, pale against the darkness. Not one of the tourists, not dressed in bright jackets or hats, but instead blurred, indistinct, as though caught mid-motion, and though debates broke out immediately among investigators. Was it just a tree trunk, a trick of light, a camera glitch? Rose seized the photo, his face paling as he whispered, "They weren't alone out there," and the words sank like stones into the silence of the tent. The officials dismissed it quickly, reminding everyone that the human brain loves to find patterns in noise, that shadows play tricks, but when the phone records confirmed the timestamp, it left a crack in their certainty, because if that last photo was real, then someone else had been present in the woods with the missing group, watching them, perhaps approaching them, and if someone else was there, then the next question carried a weight that chilled every person at the table. If the photo was real, then who was in those trees, and what did they want? The third week of the investigation began with renewed urgency and renewed mistakes, as local authorities, pressured by the mounting anxiety of families and the relentless media glare, threw resources into chasing a lead that in hindsight would appear both flimsy and tragically misdirected, for a hiker claimed to have seen a group of people moving through the northern canyon, a barren stretch of red stone and jagged cliffs where shadows pooled and heat shimmered in the distance. And though the account was vague and even internally contradictory, officials seized on it with near desperation, ordering helicopters, dogs, and patrols into the area while telling the families that progress was finally being made. But beneath the surface of this declared progress, fractures were forming between the families who had waited for weeks for truth and the investigators who were now locked into a theory they seemed unwilling to question, between local officers who wanted to be seen as decisive and the few quiet voices inside their own ranks who whispered that something about the narrative didn't add up, and most of all between the veneer of official certainty and the growing suspicion of a detective who had been brought in only days earlier to review the case, a man named Elias Hart, tall, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, who had worked dozens of missing persons files before and who knew the patterns of both honest mistakes and institutional cover-ups. Families camped outside the sheriff's office, their tents and lawn chairs lining the sidewalk like a vigil that would not end, their voices sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes breaking into shouting matches with deputies who could not give them answers. And the atmosphere was electric with grief and suspicion, mothers holding photographs, fathers demanding timelines, siblings clutching at any rumor that might explain the silence, while the press circled like vultures, each headline more breathless than the last, each news van more invasive, and through it all the canyon search grew more elaborate, yet no closer to truth. Footprints misidentified, bones discovered that turned out to be animal remains, a torn backpack that belonged to a hunter lost years before, a notebook filled with old maps mistaken for recent clues, each disappointment widening the rift between those in power and those left powerless. Detective Hart walked the canyon edge one afternoon, staring at the search teams scouring the rocks. And in his gut, he knew the lead was wrong, that the missing four could not have come this way. Not without water, not without someone reporting their presence on the narrow access road, not without leaving fresher signs, but every time he raised a question, he was met with thin smiles and clipped reassurances from the sheriff's inner circle. Men who had already gone on camera to promise significant developments, and so could not easily back down without losing face or perhaps exposing something deeper than face-saving. In the evenings, Hart returned to the small motel where he was lodged, spreading the case files across the bed, staring at receipts, timelines, phone records, and again his eyes fell on a detail that had been logged but never pursued. A gas station attendant, young and nervous, had told deputies he thought he saw the tour bus pull in late on the second day of the disappearance, its passengers stepping out briefly, some stretching their legs, one of them speaking in low tones to a man who was not among the missing, a man who leaned against a truck with tinted windows and a face the attendant could not describe clearly, though he remembered sunglasses, a hat pulled low, and a jacket despite the heat. Yet in the official report the statement had been filed as unverified and then ignored, for it did not fit the canyon theory. And Hart's experience told him that the most dangerous mistakes in investigations often came not from a lack of evidence, but from the willful blindness to evidence that disrupted the neatness of an official story. Families began to sense this too, for rumors of the gas station sighting circulated among them, whispered during late-night gatherings in parking lots and diners, and tension sharpened until one evening a shouting match erupted between two fathers, one demanding that they march to the sheriff's office and force a redirection of the search, the other begging for patience lest they alienate the very people who still held resources. And the scene devolved into tears, apologies, but also a deepening recognition that the clock was not on their side. Hart chose that night to act quietly, driving out to the gas station himself, standing at the pump where the attendant swore he had seen the bus, feeling the eerie silence of the empty lot, the hum of a flickering light, the faint smell of gasoline and dust, and he questioned the young man again, this time listening with care, asking him to describe the voices, the gestures, the exact timing, and though the details remained hazy, there was conviction in the boy's eyes, conviction enough that Hart began to sketch his own private map of the investigation, a map that diverged sharply from the official Canyon Center narrative. Meanwhile, in the sheriff's office, unease grew as media drones failed to capture any trace of the missing, and one deputy, perhaps careless, perhaps weary, muttered within earshot of a reporter that we might be looking in the wrong place, sparking fresh headlines and further inflaming the families. And though the sheriff tried to clamp down with statements about keeping all possibilities open, the truth was that resources were being drained by the canyon chase, and every day spent there was a day further from the real trail. Hart returned to his motel room late one evening to find a package slipped under his door, a plain envelope without return address, inside of which was a crumpled, water-stained page torn from a small journal, the kind tourists sometimes carried to jot down impressions, sketches, fragments of thought, and across the line paper were hurried words written in a hand that shook either from haste or fear. We're supposed to take the secret route. He said it would be safer, faster, and that we'd meet him there. I don't know if we should trust this, but everyone seems convinced. Tomorrow we find out. The handwriting matched one of the missing tourists, a young woman whose family had provided samples for identification, and the implication chilled Hart, for it meant that the disappearance was not a spontaneous misfortune but a planned divergence, that someone had persuaded them to deviate from the expected itinerary and into the unknown, and the final line, underlined twice, seemed to vibrate with dread as Hart read it again and again. Who were they planning to meet? A biting autumn wind moved across the ridges, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and fallen pine needles. When the discovery was made, though at first it seemed small, incidental, something a hunter or hiker might glance at and pass by, but this time fate made sure that did not happen, and the man who stumbled across it would later say he felt something tugging him forward, a sense that the forest itself wanted to reveal one more secret from the ground it had held for too long. He had been tracking deer through the northern slope, the air brittle, his boots crunching over frosted leaves, when his dog darted ahead toward a cluster of boulders tucked into a low ravine where runoff water pooled after rains. And as he followed, shotgun slung over his shoulder, he noticed a half-buried shape wedged between two stones, a flash of faded fabric where there should have been only moss and shale, and when he knelt and cleared away the damp debris, he pulled out what looked like a torn backpack, strapped stiff with mildew, its zipper broken but still holding the ghost of its former contents. Inside were scraps of clothing, a stained t-shirt with a faded logo, a wool sock matted with dirt, and a water bottle that had cracked under pressure of the rocks. But there was more, something that made him stop, sit back on his heels, and call the sheriff without touching another item. A notebook, its cover warped and pages curled from moisture, but clearly written in and folded into its center, a small strip of paper with numbers that looked like coordinates scrawled in uneven handwriting, alongside words he could barely decipher, something about the bus, not safe, and watching. By the time deputies arrived, the sun had dipped low, painting the treetops red, and the scene was treated with the same gravity as a crime scene, yellow tape strung in the middle of wilderness, flashlights cutting across the rocks as evidence bags filled with the contents of that backpack, each piece sealed and numbered, while the hunter who found it sat on a stump, silent, replaying the sight of that notebook over and over, knowing he had stepped into the orbit of a story that had been whispered in the town for years, but never fully answered. The mystery of the missing hikers and the abandoned bus deep in the forest. When forensic teams examined the items days later in the county lab, they found more than just damp cloth and mildew. The clothing showed faint but consistent traces of unusual toxins, not the kind one would expect from spoiled food or environmental exposure, but compounds used in agriculture that suggested deliberate contamination. And the notebook, once carefully dried and restored, revealed jagged handwriting across several pages, phrases repeating like a mantra. They followed, not safe at night, bus is wrong, and a final desperate scrawl, we should never have gone. The coordinates, when plotted, landed not on the bus itself, but several kilometers northeast, on a rocky stretch of land riddled with caves, one of which investigators discovered when they hiked out, had been used as a makeshift cache, stones piled deliberately to conceal additional belongings. A blanket, a rusted knife, and several plastic containers wrapped in cloth, their lids marked with residue that matched the same agricultural toxins found on the clothing. The implication chilled everyone who studied the evidence. Someone had not only known about the bus, but had staged aspects of what would be found there, planting items, arranging scenes, perhaps even moving belongings to mislead anyone who came searching. This sent shockwaves through the families who had been waiting for closure, because until then they could cling to the idea that the disappearance had been an accident, a wrong turn in the woods, exposure to weather, bad luck, but now there was proof of intent, of manipulation, of someone's hand in shaping the tragedy. In the courthouse basement where the families were shown the evidence privately, the air grew heavy as the photographs of the notebook and the coordinate slip were projected on the wall. One mother pressed her palm against her lips and whispered her daughter's name, tears streaming down her cheeks as she shook her head, unable to reconcile the possibility that her child's last days were spent under the shadow of surveillance and poison. Another father clenched his fists and demanded to know who would do such a thing, his voice cracking. And in the silence that followed his outburst, the investigators could only admit what the evidence suggested, that the bus was not a place of refuge stumbled upon in desperation, but perhaps a stage set by someone who wanted it to be discovered, arranged in such a way that the story it told would not be the truth, but a version designed to mislead. Reporters kept at a distance, pieced together fragments of the story as rumors spread. That personal belongings had been found in a cave, that chemicals were involved, that the notebook hinted at someone watching from the shadows, and while officials tried to temper speculation, the narrative was already out of their hands, spiraling through the community like wildfire. Locals who had once romanticized the bus as a tragic landmark now whispered about it with unease, wondering if every visitor who trekked out there in search of meaning had been walking into a monument not to survival, but to manipulation. Some suggested the toxins were planted later, to cloud the investigation, while others insisted that the missing had been deliberately lured, trapped by circumstances beyond their control, and in either case the central fact remained. The belongings in the cave, hidden with such care, meant someone had been there long after the bus was abandoned, someone who wanted pieces of the story to surface and others to remain buried. Late at night in the sheriff's office, detectives spread maps and photographs across a table, tracing lines between the coordinates, the cave, the bus, and the strange pattern that emerged, a triangle of locations that seemed too deliberate to be coincidence. And one rookie deputy asked what everyone else was thinking. If someone wanted us to find the bus like that, what didn't they want us to find? That question lingered in the air, heavier than the autumn fog, and though no one answered, the silence itself became its own kind of response, because deep down they all felt the same dread. They were no longer unraveling a disappearance. They were walking into the architecture of a plan. And for the families who went home that night, with the images of their children's belongings burned into their minds, the hope they had carried for so long fractured into sharper edges. Some still clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, someone had survived, had left those warnings in the notebook as a message, while others collapsed under the weight of despair, realizing the clues might only confirm what they had feared all along. Yet even as grief gnawed at them, another truth settled over the investigation like frost on the grass. The bus wasn't abandoned by accident. Someone wanted it to be found this way. But why? The search for the missing passengers had taken investigators across forests, ridges, and abandoned cabins. But the newest trail pulled them into a place that few dared to enter willingly, the jagged line of glacier caves that stretched beneath the mountains like frozen catacombs, shifting constantly with the seasons and threatening collapse at the slightest disturbance. And though the local authorities advised against entering, citing the dangers of falling ice and sudden floods, the investigative team knew they had little choice for the evidence found in the forest house, a fragment of a forged logbook and a set of tire impressions leading north, aligned too neatly with rumors whispered by miners long ago about hidden tunnels once used to transport, or tunnels that now seemed connected to something far darker than mining history, something perhaps tied to the 4 travelers who vanished without a trace, only to be rediscovered months later as hollow shadows of themselves. And so, against official orders, they carried ropes, lamps, and recording gear into the glacier mouth, their breaths turning into mist that instantly froze on their faces as the walls around them groaned with ancient weight, the sound echoing like the moans of buried men. And it was there, deep inside the blue glow of the ice, that one of them spotted what looked too clean, too recent to belong. Metal scrapes across the ice, as if a truck or generator had been dragged inside, leading them to a chamber where the ice had melted unnaturally smooth, revealing a hatch that plunged downward into a shaft lined with rotting timbers, a tunnel from the abandoned mining network. Their hearts raced because it meant someone had been here recently, using the mines to stage movements, to cover tracks, to vanish people in plain sight. But as they descended, the danger became real, the planks groaning under their boots, the air thick with a stench of oil and rust, and the oppressive silence pressing on them so hard that every step felt like trespassing into a place deliberately sealed. Then came the deeper risk when their lamps caught movement not from the investigators but from shadows ahead, flickers of someone else's light vanishing deeper in the tunnels, raising questions. Who else knew they were here? Who else was trying to keep this hidden? But before they could advance, a tremor cracked through the mine, sending a spray of pebbles and dust from above, threatening collapse, forcing them to scramble forward in blind faith that the passage would hold, lungs choking on debris until they burst into a cavern where the shock of discovery silenced them all. For there sat a vehicle, a weather-beaten truck coated in a thin layer of frost, yet unmistakably recent, its license plates filed off, but the tires matching the impressions from the forest. Its bed empty save for scattered restraints and tarps, stained with something no one wished to name, and next to it, boxes of fake radio, transmitters, and papers forged to mimic emergency distress signals. Evidence that someone had staged the cries for help that first alerted search parties, evidence that someone had manipulated the timeline of the disappearance to make it appear accidental when it was meticulously orchestrated. But even more disturbing was the register they uncovered inside the truck's cab, a ledger not of supplies, but of names, dates, and coded notes, entries that seemed to mark transfers, relocations, and in some cases, ominous symbols instead of destinations. And among the names were the 4 hikers whose faces had become part of the country's mystery, listed as moved 12 kilometers south, Valley Hold, and the word clear beside their final entry, as if their fate had been sealed long before they were discovered in the forest house, alive but dazed, unable to explain where they had been, raising the horrible suspicion that their confusion was not natural but inflicted, the result of being controlled, displaced, staged as actors in someone else's script. And yet, even with this discovery, the conflict with authorities boiled over, for when the investigators attempted to bring the evidence to light, a local enforcement unit intercepted them at the tunnel entrance, insisting that all findings were classified and demanding the immediate surrender of the truck's ledger and the forged transmitters. But the lead investigator refused, his voice breaking with anger as he shouted that people's lives had been played with, that the truth was buried beneath ice and bureaucracy. And for a tense moment, it seemed guns would be drawn in the frozen dark, until the collapse of another section of tunnel forced both groups to retreat, the roar of falling stone drowning their argument. The cave itself rejecting further trespass. Still, the investigators smuggled out photographs, documents hastily snapped before the confrontation, and when they regrouped outside the glacier under a sky streaked with dying daylight, their minds raced with the realization that the case was no longer just about missing travelers, but about a hidden system designed to relocate, confuse, and erase, a system with resources and planning far beyond what any lone abductor could achieve. And though they planned to press further, to storm the valley marked in the ledger as the supposed hold, dread not at their resolve. Because if 4 ordinary hikers could be taken, manipulated, and returned as living ghosts, then countless others could have vanished into the same machinery without a trace, their names reduced to ink on pages kept hidden in a frozen truck. And just as they prepared to move, following the valley's coordinates, a final clue fell into their hands. One of the boxes from the mine carried a sealed envelope, water-damaged but legible, containing a map not just of the tunnels, but of connections stretching far wider. Points of relocation marked with symbols across the region. And at the bottom, scrawled in hurried ink, were the words, "The witnesses were never lost. They were shown what we needed them to see." A phrase that chilled their blood because it suggested the entire disappearance was an elaborate demonstration, not a tragedy of circumstance, but a display of control, a message sent to anyone who dared look too closely. And as they read those words beneath the hollow stare of the glacier cliffs, their stomachs sank with the certainty that they had uncovered only a fragment of the truth, because the final clue revealed the truth. But it was far darker than anyone imagined. In the end, when all the searching was done, when the mountains seemed to grow silent again after weeks of being carved open by the boots of search teams, the churning blades of helicopters, and the relentless speculation of those who had waited below, the truth emerged with the same cruelty as the cold wind that howled through the pine valleys. It had not been the mountains themselves that swallowed the 4 friends, nor some strange accident in the night, nor even an act of wandering fate that drove them off the trails into oblivion, but something more human, darker, more corrosive, and yet as old as greed and fear themselves. Because beneath every story of vanishing in the wilderness lies not only nature's indifference, but also the flaws of the people who walk into it. And the men and women who disappeared that autumn had crossed paths with both indifference and cruelty, and neither had shown them mercy. When the bodies were at last recovered, huddled in the dust and shadow of the abandoned house nearly 100 kilometers away from the point where they had first gone missing, they were not scattered by some accident, but laid together as if by human hands, the bones clean in places where time and small scavengers had done their work, clothing ragged yet still recognizable. And the silence of that house seemed to sigh with all that had taken place inside it. A silence broken only by the creak of the wooden floorboards when detectives stepped into the rooms. There, flashlights sweeping across walls that bore faint scratches, desperate carvings of initials, crude lines counting days, and a lingering presence of lives cut short, as though the walls themselves had watched and remembered but refused to speak. It took weeks of examination, the delicate reconstruction of events from fragments of evidence, from phone records never deleted, from local witnesses who had seen lights and trucks in the forest that should not have been there, from an overlooked receipt in a gas station along the old road where someone had filled jerry cans on the night of their disappearance, and from the confessions, half truthful, half concealed, of men who had once sworn to keep their mouths closed, but pressure and conscience wore them thin until finally one spoke, and then another. And at last the story formed like a dark picture long hidden under dust, revealing a truth that was never going to bring peace, but at least could bring an ending. The 4 had not simply vanished by accident, but had stumbled into something they were never meant to see, a smuggling route hidden deep in the ridges, where trucks carried unmarked containers through paths the authorities had long since forgotten to monitor, and the house in the forest had been more than abandoned. It was a stopover, a warehouse in disguise, watched over by men who feared nothing more than exposure. And when the hikers arrived there, lost, cold, desperate for shelter, knocking on a door that was never meant to be opened by outsiders, they were met not with kindness but with suspicion and threat, their presence seen as a danger that could unravel years of carefully hidden operations. And so they were detained, locked inside under the pretense that they would be released once things quieted. But greed and fear do not loosen their grip easily, and the longer they were kept, the more dangerous their knowledge became, until at last the decision was made in whispers and shadows that they would never leave the house alive. No one knew exactly how the final hours unfolded, whether they begged, whether they resisted, whether one tried to run. But the evidence showed bindings, marks on the beams where ropes had been tied, and the silence of the survivors' phones, crushed and hidden under the floorboards, spoke of a finality imposed upon them. It was a crime not of passion, but of calculation. And yet in its execution, it bore the recklessness of desperation. And as soon as the bodies were hidden, the men scattered, believing time and distance would cover their tracks, believing the forest would keep the secret, as so many secrets have been kept before. But time has a way of turning, of aligning chance with persistence. And the detective who had followed the trail did not relent, driven not only by duty, but by the unspoken weight of the families who waited, whose lives had been paused on a single night 2 months past, a night that never released its grip. The trial that followed shook the region, because it was not just about 4 hikers and 4 killers, but about the network of silence that had allowed such men to operate in the shadows, about officials who had looked away, about villagers who had long whispered of strange trucks but never spoke too loudly, about the quiet complicity that grows in remote places where survival often depends on ignoring what you cannot fight. And when the courtroom filled, when mothers sat in the front row clutching photographs that had long since been creased by trembling fingers, the weight of grief was palpable, an ocean of sorrow pressed into a single room. And as testimonies unfolded, the details tore through the families like fresh wounds, because even though they had wanted the truth was unbearable, and yet it was all they had left. In the end, the guilty were sentenced, some to decades behind bars, others to lives that would never again be free. And the newspapers declared justice done, though those who had lost knew better, because justice is never balance. It is only a kind of closing of circle, a word stamped on paper while real lives remain broken. But even so, the revelation exposed the rot beneath the surface. It forced light into corners long left untouched. And perhaps, in that, there was a kind of victory, though a hollow one. Afterward, when the detective drove alone back into the mountains, following the same winding roads that the missing had once taken, he pulled over by a ridge, where the valley opened wide beneath the fading autumn light, and he thought of them, not just as victims, not just as evidence in a case, but as people who had laughed, who had trusted the world enough to walk into it without fear, who had carried dreams and stories that were never meant to end in an abandoned house. And he realized that in his career he had uncovered many truths, but none had ever restored what was lost. None had ever brought back the warmth of a living presence. And he wondered, as he always did, whether the truth itself was enough, whether the act of telling it mattered in the long shadow of grief. And though he could not answer, he knew it was the only gift he could offer, because silence would have been worse. When he returned the photographs to the families, when he stood with them at the graves where the mountains had finally released their dead, he said little, for there are no words large enough to fill such emptiness. And yet he carried their gazes. With him, the mix of gratitude and sorrow, the unspoken acknowledgement that sometimes closure is only a word for living with what you cannot change. And so the case was closed, the files stamped, the news cycle moved on, but the mountains remained, their slopes indifferent, their forests still whispering in the night, and in the quiet, one thought lingered in the detective's mind, as constant as the wind itself. The mountains still keep their secrets, and perhaps this was only one of them.